The immunity fantasy is cracking. Donald Trump has never really feared policy debate. He thrives on noise. He can spin a statistic, mock an opponent, or bulldoze through a question with spectacle. But there are two things he genuinely hates: facts he can't bend, and consequences he can't threaten away. Right now, he's colliding with both, not just from political opponents, not just from media critics, but from something far more destabilizing to his brand, a growing public awareness that power in America seems to protect itself, and that people are starting to notice. For years, Trump has sold a story in which he is untouchable. Indicted, it's persecution; investigated, it's weaponization; questioned, it's treason. The narrative only works if his supporters believe strength equals immunity. But outside the United States, a different story is unfolding. Around the world, democracies are doing something simple and disruptive to Trump's mythology. They're putting former leaders on trial. They're handing down sentences. They're proving that a power grab is a crime, not a branding opportunity. That contrast matters, because it quietly tells American voters something Trump desperately hopes they won't internalize. Strongman rule is not inevitable. It is a choice. And if it's a choice, it can be rejected. Look at South Korea. A former president was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For leading an insurrection linked to a failed attempt to impose martial law, prosecutors even sought the death penalty. You don't have to know the intricacies of Korean party politics to grasp the principle. In a system with institutional backbone, attempting to subvert democracy does not end in a book deal. It ends in a courtroom. It ends with a sentence. Now consider Brazil. A former president faces sentencing for attempting to overturn election results. Different continent, different culture. Same conclusion. Trying to overturn the system is not a personality quirk. It is not a branding exercise. It is not tough politics. It is criminal behavior. When two major democracies publicly reinforce that standard, it weakens the idea that powerful leaders are simply above consequence. And that's where the tension sharpens in America. Because for years, a segment of the American right has pushed in the opposite direction, not openly declaring a president above the law, but normalizing a version of politics where power itself becomes the shield. The argument isn't always he's innocent. More often it's framed as he's strong, he fights, he wins. Therefore, he should not be constrained like ordinary people. That mindset reframes accountability as weakness. It suggests that investigations are unfair by definition if they target someone influential enough. And that, distilled, is the core of the immunity narrative. Make exceptional treatment feel normal. Make loyalty more important than law. But if the public begins to compare global examples, the spell weakens. Because comparison invites a dangerous question. If other democracies can hold former leaders accountable, why can't we? That question is reasonable, and it makes the fantasy tremble. When credibility begins to slip, most politicians try to regroup. They recalibrate messaging. They soften tone. They pivot. Trump does something else. He performs. He builds bigger stages, louder moments. Glossy events designed to dominate headlines long enough to bury uncomfortable questions. When pressure rises, spectacle rises with it. It's a strategy he understands instinctively. If you can't erase scrutiny, overwhelm it. A clear example is the so-called Board of Peace event, framed as a sweeping global initiative, marketed with language that suggests it stands above traditional institutions like the United Nations. That's familiar Trump branding. Give it a grand title, declare it historic, package it as world-shifting. And trust that the scale of the announcement distracts from the details, but legitimacy isn't created by proclamation. It isn't born from a press release. Real international credibility comes from participation, from allies committing resources, from institutions recognizing authority. It comes from whether the world sees you as stabilizing, was not destabilizing. You can build a stage, you can brand an event, but you can't manufacture consensus by decree. And that's where the contrast grows sharper. Because at the same time Trump amplifies spectacle, his credibility is absorbing pressure from multiple directions. One of those pressures involves renewed public attention around Jeffrey Epstein-related transparency. Not because every name mentioned in documents automatically equals guilt. It doesn't. But because people are reacting to something deeper, the appearance of selective transparency. For years, Trump's political movement energized its base around the demand to release the files. It framed disclosure as a moral imperative. Transparency was cast as righteous. Accountability was framed as cleansing. But when scrutiny inches closer to Trump's orbit, the tone shifts. Suddenly it's old news. Suddenly it's irrelevant. Suddenly it's a witch hunt. That pivot is not subtle, and contradictions like that don't simply create controversy. They erode credibility. Because credibility depends on consistency. If transparency is sacred when it harms opponents, but optional when it threatens allies, the moral argument collapses. And the public can sense the difference. The tension intensifies when you zoom out internationally. In countries with long histories of entrenched power, public investigations into high-profile figures connected to scandal continue to unfold. The message those societies send isn't that they're flawless. It's something simpler. Scrutiny is not treason. Accountability is not sabotage. Questions are not acts of war. That principle is destabilizing for Trump's political framework because his survival strategy depends on reframing scrutiny as persecution. Investigations become attacks, criticism becomes conspiracy, institutional checks become weaponization. The narrative only works if voters accept the equation. Accountability equals political revenge. But the moment that equation fails, the moment voters distinguish between scrutiny and persecution, the protective shield weakens. Because if oversight is legitimate, then immunity is not, and that is the central tension. Trump's political model thrives on converting legal pressure into emotional solidarity. Every investigation becomes proof that he is fighting for you. Every court proceeding becomes evidence of establishment fear. It transforms accountability into validation. But that alchemy has limits. It depends on repetition. It depends on loyalty. And it depends on public fatigue with complexity. If voters begin to evaluate each situation independently, asking whether transparency should apply evenly, the narrative grows brittle. The spectacle becomes harder to maintain, and spectacle, while powerful, cannot permanently substitute for legitimacy. Legitimacy requires something quieter and harder to fake: trust. Trust that institutions are acting in good faith. Trust that rules apply broadly. Trust that powerful figures are not shielded by status alone. When that trust weakens, leaders often lean more heavily on performance because performance is controllable. You can script an event, you can curate attendees, you can choreograph applause. You cannot choreograph credibility, and that is the crossroads embedded in this moment. If voters continue to equate scrutiny with persecution, the immunity narrative survives. But if voters begin to separate accountability from vendetta, the political foundation shifts. Because a movement built on exceptional treatment cannot coexist easily with a culture that expects equal treatment. Once citizens accept that powerful figures should answer questions like anyone else, the aura of untouchability fades. And without that aura, spectacle feels thinner. The immunity fantasy depends on convincing Americans that any attempt to scrutinize is corrupt. The moment that belief erodes, the architecture weakens. The stage lights still shine, the branding still dazzles. But underneath, the emotional insulation thins. And once the insulation thins, accountability stops feeling like persecution. It starts feeling like process. The moment people decide to look anyway, the immunity fantasy begins to crack. Now let's talk about something that doesn't care about branding: economics. Trump loves the language of victory when it comes to trade. We're winning. Best deals. Tough negotiations. It's strong, declarative, applause-friendly language. But trade deficits aren't slogans. They aren't chants. They're numbers. And numbers don't respond to charisma. If trade gaps widen while tariffs add friction to supply chains and raise costs for consumers, the mythology of the master dealmaker starts to strain. You can frame tariffs as leverage. You can brand them as toughness. But when prices rise and imbalances persist, The scoreboard doesn't move just because the rhetoric does. Numbers don't clap at rallies. They show up in grocery bills. They show up in construction materials. They show up in the quiet anxiety families feel at the end of the month. And that's where the tough guy narrative meets economic gravity. Then there's Canada. Of all the places to flex rhetorical muscle, targeting America's closest ally carries consequences that aren't symbolic. Canada isn't a distant adversary. It's deeply integrated into the American economy. It is America's largest source of foreign visitors, a major trading partner, a strategic partner in energy, security, and manufacturing. When that relationship cools, when trust declines and rhetoric sharpens, it doesn't just bruise feelings. It hits tourism revenue. It disrupts supply chains. It complicates cross-border cooperation. Allies matter because stability matters. Picking public fights with your nearest partner may energize a political base that equates confrontation with strength. But strength in international economics often looks like predictability, not volatility. Markets value steadiness. Investors value reliability. Allies value trust. When those signals weaken, the cost doesn't stay abstract. It trickles down. And while ordinary Americans absorb higher prices and economic uncertainty, what do they see from leadership? They see reports of luxury procurement, executive aircraft outfitted with high-end amenities. Even if every detail of acquisition is technically defensible, the optics speak loudly. When families are told to tighten belts and government appears to be upgrading comfort, it creates a perception gap. Austerity for the public, comfort for the powerful. That perception cuts against the populist image. But when symbols of excess emerge during economic strain, it doesn't feel like solidarity. It feels like hierarchy. And hierarchy contradicts the us versus the elite messaging. Layered on top of the economic tension is something more theatrical. Performative masculinity, chest-thumping language, warlike tone, aggressive posturing presented as strength. This style of politics turns geopolitical risk into spectacle. Military escalation becomes a demonstration of toughness. Geopolitical tension becomes content. Conflict becomes branding. But war is not theater. It is not a vibe. It is not a marketing asset. The Constitution is clear. The power to declare war rests with Congress. The president is commander-in-chief, but not a unilateral war maker. That separation exists for a reason. It forces debate. It forces deliberation. It forces shared accountability. When members of Congress push back against unilateral escalation, that is not partisan nitpicking. It is a structural safeguard. The guardrail matters because war carries irreversible consequences. When leaders begin to frame military action as a personal demonstration of resolve, the line between national interest and personal branding blurs. And that's where democracies become vulnerable, because strongman politics thrives on collapsing that distinction. It reframes "I decided" as "the nation decided." Strength in a democracy is not just loudness, it is balance, it is constraint, it is institutional respect. Markets respond to predictability more than bravado. The tough guy illusion works best when outcomes aren't closely examined. It's not simply about whether rhetoric sounds strong, it's whether strength is producing durable results. In the end, governance isn't performance, it's consequence. And once the illusion frays, the audience begins to see what's underneath, not dominance, but dependency on the image of it. All of this, the legal tension, the spectacle, the economic friction, the international contrast, converges on one thing: public mood. Politics ultimately runs on perception, and perception shifts before outcomes do. Polls are not prophecy. They don't guarantee victory or defeat, but they are signals. They measure energy. They measure fatigue. They measure belief. And when credible head-to-head polling shows Trump trailing a major Democratic challenger, something subtle but important happens. The inevitability myth begins to soften. For years, inevitability has been one of Trump's greatest political assets, the sense that he cannot be stopped, that attacks only strengthen him. That criticism fuels him, that consequence slides off him. But inevitability is psychological, and psychology shifts when numbers suggest vulnerability. Because Trump's political brand rests on a set of promises, strong, declarative, emotionally satisfying promises, law and order, while arguing for exceptional legal treatment. An end to weaponization, while shielding political allies from scrutiny. Business genius, while economic pressures remain stubborn and deficits widen. American respect, while long-standing allies grow skeptical. Dignity restored, while controversies and displays of excess continue to swirl. Each individual contradiction can be defended in isolation. Politics is messy. Context matters. Narratives compete. But when you stack them together, the weight accumulates. Contradiction doesn't always collapse a movement, but it erodes confidence. And erosion is quieter than scandal. It's slower than outrage, but it's often more decisive. When you zoom out far enough, the through line becomes clearer. Trump isn't reacting defensively because critics are loud. Critics have always been loud. He's reacting because comparison now exists in plain sight. Comparison to democracies where former leaders face consequences, where courts function independently, where investigations don't automatically translate into collapse. Comparison disrupts mythology. It asks voters to imagine a political system where strength is compatible with accountability, not threatened by it, and that comparison cuts directly into the core of the brand, because the movement's energy has always depended on one foundational belief: he is different. He cannot fall. The rules don't apply in the same way, but when polling signals vulnerability, the emotional insulation thins. The strongman image depends on projection. Projection of dominance, projection of inevitability, projection of invulnerability. Once voters see even a flicker of fragility, the projection changes. Strength begins to look like strain. Confidence begins to look like defensiveness. Control begins to look like containment. And that's the pivot. Because nothing undermines a strongman narrative faster than the perception that he needs protection. If a leader requires the entire political apparatus to appear powerful, the image itself becomes fragile. Real authority does not require exemption. Real confidence does not require insulation from questions. Real strength does not depend on redefining accountability as persecution. When the public starts to internalize that distinction, something subtle but profound shifts. The performance still exists, the rallies still happen, the messaging still rolls out, but the aura feels thinner, and that thinning shows up everywhere. In headlines that no longer shock, in institutions that continue operating, in allies recalibrating relationships, in voters who no longer assume inevitability. Public patience changes before public allegiance does. Exhaustion accumulates, doubt accumulates, skepticism accumulates, and political brands depend on emotional loyalty. Once that loyalty weakens, messaging has to work harder, spectacle has to grow larger, volume has to increase, but volume cannot permanently replace trust. The deeper theme here isn't about one poll. It isn't about one controversy. It's about narrative erosion. Trump wants Americans to believe that immunity is natural. That strength means exemption. That consequence equals chaos. But the world keeps offering counterexamples. Democracies can hold leaders accountable and survive. Institutions can function under pressure. Power can be challenged without collapse. The more those examples accumulate, the harder it becomes to sustain the myth. That accountability equals weakness. And once that myth dissolves, the strongman act changes shape. It stops looking imposing. It starts looking defensive. It stops looking inevitable. It starts looking conditional. That's the crack widening right now. Not always dramatically, not always explosively, but steadily. In public mood, in institutional confidence, in allied trust, in the quiet recalculations of voters who once assumed nothing could shift. Political movements don't unravel in a single moment. They weaken when the central promise no longer feels convincing, if the promise is strength without consequence. And voters begin to see consequence as normal rather than catastrophic, the promise loses its power. Because in the end, nothing appears weaker than a leader who must convince the entire country that he is above the law in order to appear strong. That's the tension defining this moment, and whether it widens or closes will depend less on rhetoric and more on whether voters choose inevitability or accountability. I'm Isabella Pierce, and I'm just saying.